Appearing in over 50 pictures, Clara Bow was the #1 box office draw and ultimate sex symbol of early Hollywood. Leaving the crushing poverty of a bleak Brooklyn childhood behind her, she became the supremely self-confident star of Tinseltown in its gloriously unrestrained heyday. And yet the first It Girl, the megastar who was getting 30,000 fan letters a month, the woman who every man wanted to meet, walked away from it all for a quiet life in the country. Why? I'm Graeme Yorston. Welcome to my channel. Today we're continuing our exploration of the life of one of the most exciting and flamboyant stars of early Hollywood, Clara Bow. In the first part we heard about her meteoric rise from the tenements to roller skating without a care in the world outside her Beverly Hills mansion. It was a life she had dreamed of, a life she had longed for, worked hard for, but a life that still left her lonely and sad. Before we get going, can I ask you to consider subscribing if you haven't already done so? It really helps the channel grow. And if you hit the notifications button, then you'll get to see each new video as soon as it's released. Clara's looks, with her expressive eyes and winning persona, had made her the undisputed favourite of American moviegoers. And her frequent engagements to handsome men, that never quite seemed to end in a walk down the aisle, had so far not put anyone off. She was the epitome of the exciting, glamorous, prosperous, everything new and live for today jazz age. But the world was changing. Al Jolson and the jazz singer meant that there were now microphones for actors to contend with, as well as cameras. And the roaring 20s were about to spectacularly run out of steam.
Too young or too weak.
The Wild Party was Clara's first talkie. She was usually so at ease on set, but she really struggled with the shooting of this film, having to do endless retakes as her eyes kept wandering up to the microphone above her. And not knowing how loud to pitch her voice, she famously blew out the valves more than once. "I hate talkies," she said. "They're stiff and limiting. You lose a lot of your cuteness because there's no chance for action. And action is the most important thing to me." To allow her to keep moving, the director, Dorothy Arzner, devised the first boom microphone, and Clara had to concede, "I can't buck progress. I have to do the best I can." The gossip columns, always looking for a new story, were so keen to link her to co-star Frederick March that no one noticed she was living with ex-prizefighter and stuntman Jimmy Dundee, and had even installed a ring in a garden for him to train for a comeback. When the film was released, it had mixed reviews, Bow's Brooklyn accent being the main topic of discussion. "Smooth, vigorous and natural," said one. "Harsh and not very easy on sensitive eardrums," said another. But it did well at the box office, confirming that Clara could still pull in the crowds in the sound era. In 1929, she had a much publicised affair with Harry Richman, a New York entertainer who ran a Manhattan speakeasy which enjoyed the protection of Al Capone as a customer. He met Clara on a trip to Hollywood to make his debut movie, Puddin' on the Ritz, and they were soon engaged. But as one newspaper put it, Clara's engagements are about as frequent and enduring as the average girl's headaches. She followed him to New York, where he paraded her around like a prize poodle, and boasted about their vigorous love life and the pleasures of a bearskin rug. She put up with all of this for a while, but occasionally snuck off to reunite with her old flame Gary Cooper. In the October Photoplay magazine, for once it was someone else on the cover, Bow described her nerves as all shot, and said she'd reached breaking point. Unhappy Clara is the comment, highlighting rows of bottles of sedatives by her bed. Her biggest issue at this time was that Paramount wanted her to sing. But something else happened in October 1929 that brought an abrupt end to the carefree flapper era. There were also rumours that she had to go off for a gynecological operation at a private clinic. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. For once, the rumours were true. She did have an operation, but not the one people suspected. She had to have one of her ovaries removed, a major operation in the pre-antibiotic 1920s. The previous year she'd had her appendix removed, and even before her stitches were out, she had fallen for a young surgical intern, Dr. Earl Pearson. Tall, handsome, charming. He could have been the one, except he was already somebody else's one. And when his wife found out, she threatened to divorce him and named Clara in the courts. When Paramount got word of the scandal, Clara found out she still had a morality clause in her contract after all. Her father hadn't checked the small print. And she forfeited over $50,000 in bonuses, which they paid to keep Clara's name out of the divorce. The studio also decided it was probably better not to make use of a publicity shot of her in a wedding dress. With The Saturday Night Kid and Dangerous Curves also released in 1929, Bow kept her position as the top box office draw and queen of Hollywood. She had survived the introduction of sound and the press for now.
I guess you didn't realize how much the show needs you.
Gosh, if that's the way.
I knew you'd feel that way about it. Jane, you're a wonderful guy.
But the pressure was beginning to tell, and her boss, B.P. Schulberg, began referring to her as Crisis a Day Clara. When her cousin Billy had been sent to jail for selling bootleg liquor, Clara had discovered that there is such a thing as bad publicity. And when the press got hold of stories about her gambling habits and debts of $14,000 to a Lake Tahoe casino, the studio felt they had to distance themselves, saying her debts were hers and hers alone. In 1930, she appeared in 4 releases: Paramount on Parade, Love Among the Millionaires, Her Wedding Night, and while making True to the Navy, she met the man who would finally walk her down the aisle, fellow actor Rex Bell. With only 4 releases in the year, she slipped to 2nd place after Joan Crawford at the box office. It had been coming for a while. Overwork, ill health, public scandals, and the relentless pressure of fame were finally beginning to catch up with her. But if things were not going well, they were about to get a whole lot worse. Daisy DeVoe, former hairdresser, now Clara's bookkeeper, secretary, best friend and confidant, more like a sister than an employee, sensed new boyfriend Rex wanted to get rid of her. She was right. Rex didn't trust her and thought she was fleecing Clara, as she always used cash to pay Clara's bills and reimbursed herself from Clara's special account. And for her part, Daisy didn't trust Rex. She was convinced he was trying to use Clara to buy him a ranch. It all came to a head when Daisy overheard them talking, and Clara reluctantly agreeing with Rex to let her go. Daisy angrily grabbed as many documents as she could carry from a filing cabinet, along with a checkbook for the special account, and ran. The next day, Rex had the locks changed, and she was not allowed in the house, and lawyers demanded the documents back. Although their arrangements were unusual and undoubtedly left Clara vulnerable, Daisy had actually rescued her finances from her father's mismanagement and helped her put away $250,000 into a trust in less than 2 years, giving her the financial independence she had always longed for. But Daisy was angry that she was now being discarded for the latest man who she thought would last no longer than the others, and she hastily said that she could have the documents back for $125,000. Although she immediately regretted her words and tried to apologise, it was too late. She was arrested and subjected to a 27-hour interrogation. After which, she was indicted on 37 counts of grand theft. If convicted, she faced a possible jail term of 300 years. The trial began in January 1931. The newspapers had sensationalised the affair and whipped up interest. It promised to be the biggest Hollywood courtroom entertainment since the Fatty Arbuckle trial 10 years before. Any loyalty DeVoe may once have had was now long gone. "I'll tell the world a few things when I get on the witness stand," she promised. Thousands waited outside, pushing and shoving to get a ringside seat. DeVoe looked calm, confident, defiant. Clara, on the other hand, looked pale and scared. She hated being in public and clung onto Rex for support. Who was it who was meant to be on trial exactly? After having to admit taking the documents and demanding money, DeVoe cleverly answered questions to blacken Clara's reputation. When asked if she had asked permission to remove the contents of the filing cabinet, "No, Miss Bow was drunk," she said, reporters scribbling furiously to capture every lurid detail. "If I had gotten into any arguments with her, she would have tried to kill me. She had tried to once before." It was a lie, but one that everyone was willing to believe. She would be up all night, drinking whiskey and playing high-stakes poker games with all sorts. More tutting from the public gallery and licking of pens by the reporters. Even though she was forced to admit under cross-examination that in the high-stakes games there was a 15-cent maximum bet, and the heaviest loss Clara ever experienced was between $4 and $5, it didn't matter. Also damning were the telegrams Clara had received from her lovers over the past 2 years: Gary Cooper, Earl Pearson, Harry Richmond and Rex Bell. Each one innocent enough, but their overlapping dates seemed to confirm what many already believed, that she was leading a promiscuous, immoral lifestyle. When Clara took the stand, she did her best to stick to the issues which were relevant. But her anxiety and the goading of DeVoe's lawyer intensified her Brooklyn nasal tones, and the public, her previously adoring fans, the public that had sent her thousands of letters a week, just sniggered, reducing her to tears. Always wanting to be the centre of attention, sneered DeVoe. The judge did his best to control matters, accusing DeVoe's attorney of turning the courtroom into a mud-slinging carnival. But the newspapers revelled in it, vying with each other for the most damaging headlines. Clara Bow's spending orgies, wrote one, exaggerating everything. But in 1931, with thousands of workers being laid off and the Great Depression tightening its grip, whatever DeVoe may or may not have done, Clara was also guilty. Guilty of frivolity, guilty of excess, guilty of not being careful with her money. When her latest movie, No Limit, appeared, it was banned in parts of California and Texas, one censorship board barring it because of the notoriety of the trial. And, besides, the picture is not of a type we want shown. And as for DeVoe's claims that Clara was trying to be the centre of attention, nothing could have been further from the truth, and she stayed away from the court for the final week. When the verdict came, the jury could not agree, and the judge ordered them to resume. After another agonising 48 hours, DeVoe was acquitted on 34 of the 35 charges, but found guilty on one, theft of $825. She was sentenced to 18 months in jail. A tough sentence, and possibly even undeserved, but the impact of the whole feeding frenzy on Bow was devastating. Always fragile, always fearful of rejection, Clara needed admiration for her self-esteem. But her fans had turned against her in her darkest hour, and instead of admiration, they had laughed. Some might have felt angry, bitter at their fickleness and betrayal. But in her state of dejection, Clara turned it in on herself. "I made 'em hate me. I drove 'em away," she insisted. The ordeal left her exhausted. Her doctors ordered her to rest for a month. She had been offered City Streets and really wanted to do it. It was a great script, a more challenging role, and one that could have revived her career, but she just wasn't well enough. But completely unsympathetic, Schulberg wouldn't wait and assigned her role to newcomer Sylvia Sidney, who just so happened to be his latest mistress. After a short rest, much shorter than her doctors had advised, Clara was back on set. Paramount was determined to squeeze as much out of her remaining contract as they could. But removed from City Streets, she was assigned to a dull remake of a 1917 crime drama instead, Kick In. It didn't go well. She struggled with the dialogue and couldn't stop her eyes rolling up to the overhead microphone. The constant retakes ground her down, and she finally flipped, grabbed the microphone and pummeled it until her fists were red with blood before running off in tears. "This ain't no life," she said later, thinking it couldn't get any worse. But it could, and it did. Fred Gurnau, publisher of the seedy gossip rag Coast Reporter, decided to make a few bucks from making up sleazy stories about Clara. According to him, she had a never-ending parade of lovers, including her own family, shamelessly had sex in public places, frequented Tijuana brothels to consort with Mexican ladies of the night while her lovers watched, one of whom was supposedly driven insane by her infidelities and ended his life, after which heartless Clara is said to have shown no remorse. When there were no men around, she would frolic with women, and when there were no women, she would move on to her Great Dane Duke, even her pet koala. And because of her wicked life, she ended up being confined to a hospital to be treated for a social disease, where she got hooked on morphine. When confronted by her doctors, she had refused to give up her lifestyle, declaring she would rather die young and be a beautiful corpse than deny herself a single depravity. All complete nonsense, of course, but people lapped it up, relishing every detail of her supposed debauchery, which confirmed everything they thought they knew about the Hollywood empire of sin. Clara was in no fit state to take him to court for libel, and Gurnau knew it. He offered to sell her his newspaper for $25,000 as a way of stemming the flow of his scurrilous lies. A clever attempt at blackmail. But not so clever was sending copies to judges, local officials, and Will Hayes, president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, and the man responsible for the Hollywood Censorship Code. By doing so, he violated Section 211 of the US Penal Code, which prohibited mailing, transporting, or importing anything lewd, lascivious, or obscene. Gurnau was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in prison, but Clara was broken. Her doctors recommended an extended period of complete rest, and she wrote to Schulberg begging for a little space, even if it meant the end of her career. He didn't even bother replying. He simply got the Paramount lawyers to issue threatening letters about her being in breach of contract. Once again, she gave in and tried to return to work. But rather than give her an easy time in the remaining months of her contract, they gave her a punishing schedule and tried to rush through production. It was too much. On May Day 1931, a traditional day of joy and springtime renewal, she woke up in tears and was inconsolable. "I just can't do it. I just can't do it," she sobbed. She was admitted to Glendale Sanatorium for shattered nerves. We don't know what treatments she had, but there weren't many medication options in 1931. The first modern antidepressants were still more than 20 years away. So it is likely she would have been given a mixture of barbiturates to help her sleep and amphetamines to wake her up again. This time Schulberg accepted she was unable to carry on and graciously, oh so graciously, agreed to release her from her contract, which just so happened to save Paramount $60,000 in salary payments. When she went to the lot in June to pack up her dressing room, it had already been reassigned to Sylvia Sidney, and few bothered to say goodbye to the girl who had once been Hollywood's hottest property. Her career was effectively over at the age of 25. Clara's role in Secret Call went to newcomer Peggy Shannon, a former Ziegfeld girl spotted by Schulberg, whose career stalled quickly, and she died of the complications of alcoholism at the age of 34, just a few years later. Her cameraman husband found her slumped over the kitchen table with a cigarette in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other, and was so devastated that he ended his own life 3 weeks later. Just another sad Hollywood tale of lives cut tragically short. A week later, Rex took her to a ranch he had persuaded her to buy on the California-Nevada border. 300,000 acres of desert, scrub and dry lakes, but not much else. They called it the Shack because it really was just a shack in the middle of nowhere. A ramshackle, unpainted wooden building with a tin roof and no electricity, telephone, plumbing or heating, and definitely no aircon. They had kerosene lamps for lighting, a primitive outhouse, an outdoor shower with freezing cold water from the well, and a tin cup tied to a rusty pipe which they had to share with the ranch hands. The sun scorched her skin, the wind chapped her legs, and the 3,800 feet altitude gave her nosebleeds. It was a long way from Hollywood luxury, and she loved it. Their nearest neighbours were 8 miles away, and they had a weekly drive into the former gold mining town of Searchlight to pick up the mail. With barely 100 inhabitants, the town had no movie theatre, so people had no preconceptions about their famous new resident. And they liked her. She was friendly, natural, unaffected. For the first time in her life, Clara Bow was genuinely happy. She ate like a horse and put on 25 pounds. Until now, Rex had held back from marrying her because he didn't want gossip mongers saying he had done so to get at her money. But when he was offered a modest $500 a week contract to make a series of low-budget westerns, he felt he could now support a wife, and they drove the 70 miles to Las Vegas, still a small town of around 5,000, and got married. When the news broke that Clara Bow had finally tied the knot, reporters appeared at the ranch. "He's given me the only unselfish devotion I ever had," she proudly declared, and described how sleep, exercise and simple food had restored her health. Would she return to Hollywood, they all asked? Maybe, but for the sole purpose of making enough money to be able to stay out of it. The offers came flooding in. Earl Carroll offered her $20,000 a week for doing a single skit in his risque Vanities Review on Broadway. Not bad, but with 7 shows a day, she would never be out of the dressing room. Every studio in Hollywood, apart from Paramount, wanted her. European directors wanted her, Mary Pickford wanted her, Howard Hughes wanted her, and MGM wanted her. She agreed to do their racy comedy Red-Headed Woman, but eventually pulled out as Irving Thalberg was insisting on a long-term contract. She was not going to be tied down again. Universal offered her an adaptation of the controversial novel The Impatient Virgin, but the subject matter was just a little too close to home. In the end, she signed a 2-picture deal with independent producer Sam Rourke and Fox for $75,000 per film, plus, more importantly, script, director and cast approval. A year after her unhappy departure, Clara Bow was back. Playing a fiery-tempered young woman betrayed by selfish men and outrageous fortune, Clara's performance was well received by audiences and critics alike. The Film Daily said, looking like $1,000,000, acting better than she ever did, and playing a role that requires her to pretty much run the gamut of feminine moods and modes. Clara Bow makes a whirlwind comeback.
Call up the Union Club. Ask Mr. Lawrence Crosby. If he isn't there, get his number. Yes, miss.
The movie broke box office records at America's largest theatres as audiences flocked to see Clara's comeback in their thousands. If she'd been the vindictive type, she could have taken pleasure in the fact that at the same time as her new success, Paramount went into receivership, and Schulberg, who was blamed for the financial mess, was unceremoniously fired. But, true to form, she didn't gloat. She invited him round for dinner, and they reminisced about happier times. Pleased with their new asset and hoping to persuade her to sign a longer contract, Fox suggested Clara and Rex take a 2-month honeymoon in Europe. England, France, Switzerland and Germany.
And now here's a big surprise. I want you to meet the most gorgeous man in the world, Mr. Rex Bell, my husband. Hooray! Say hello, darling.
Hello, everybody.
For Clara, who had never been anywhere outside the US other than a few weekends across the border in Tijuana, it was a revelation. She visited galleries and museums, and despite her protestations that the Louvre was full of old-fashioned pictures down dingy corridors, she loved all the history and culture, and approved of the greater artistic freedoms. After visiting the Folies Bergère in Paris, she said, "Will Hayes ought to come over here. He'd never be so hard on poor Hollywood after that." Back in California, Fox inexplicably dithered before making her next film, Hoopla, in which she plays Lou, a hoochie-coochie dancer with a heart of gold.
Chris and I have done it, Carrie. Look. Married? Isn't it marvelous? I didn't think there was a guy living could get me like this.
The Family Circle Film Guide rated the film as pretty good entertainment and said, "This is the most acceptable bit of talkie acting Miss Bow has done." They also pointed out, however, that Miss Bow is presented in her dancing duds as often as possible, and her dancing duds wouldn't weigh 2 pounds soaking wet. Afterwards, she announced her final retirement. "I don't want to be remembered as someone who couldn't do nothing but take her clothes off." Some thought she would be back, but that was it. Hoopla was her final movie. "My life in Hollywood contained plenty of uproar," she told reporters. "I'm sorry for a lot of it, but not awfully sorry. I never did anything to hurt anyone else. I made a place for myself on the screen, and you can't do that by being Mrs. Alcott's idea of a little woman." Now she could devote herself to being a housewife and mother. First came the house. Out went the shack, and in came Rancho Clarita, a much more modern and comfortable house, but still, at her insistence, no telephone. "My desert paradise," she called it. Next came the family. Worried about her mother's history of difficult pregnancies, she rented a house in Los Angeles to be close to her obstetrician. But boredom and anxiety about her new role, a role she had no experience of, resulted in her weight doubling to 200 pounds. And when her son Tony came into the world, he needed the firm encouragement of a high forceps delivery that left him with bruised temples and a broken arm. The baby looked just like his father Rex, much to Clara's father's disappointment, who wouldn't even come and see him. The new mother fussed over her son, played bridge and discussed recipes with the other Hancock Park matrons. She was happy and didn't miss Hollywood one bit. Her second pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, however, and she fell into a deep depression. Rex realised she needed something else to focus on, and they opened the It Cafe in the Hollywood Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles. And after losing weight and returning to her slim and glamorous best, she promised to be a constant presence at the cafe. However, 2 weeks after opening, she was pregnant again, and terrified of losing it, she took to her bed.
Miss Bow, I just come in from Minnesota. Wonder would you?
In June 1938, her son George was born by C-section. His colouring was a little more typical of the Bow side of the family, and this time Clara's father was delighted. I wish I could say she lived happily ever after on her Rancho Clarita with her adoring husband and 2 strapping sons. But it just wasn't to be. Rex got into politics and often had to stay away overnight. He wanted Clara to be with him, but she just wasn't interested. As he got more deeply involved, he was away more often, and Clara grew suspicious, accusing him of every manner of infidelity. There were no grounds for her fears, but Rex got an earful every time he went away, and one time she shot out the tyres on his car to keep him home. She developed backache, headaches, toothache, abdominal cramps and constipation, and her lifelong pattern of poor sleep continued. Despite taking 5 Nembitals a night, she would finally drift off at sunrise and emerge groggy and bleary-eyed mid-afternoon. Clara was someone who needed constant reassurance, and Rex wasn't able to sit up all night telling her she was great. He was just getting on with life. But this was enough to leave her feeling abandoned and betrayed. Her desert paradise had turned into a living hell. Despite all her myriad symptoms, none of her doctors could find anything wrong. So they suggested she have a thorough battery of tests at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. After 2 weeks, they found nothing, and her neurologist, Fred Mersch, suggested she had a personality problem. So she spent 4 months at Kimball Sanitarium and left, feeling a little better, but still convinced that her problems were physical. She returned to her life at Rancho Clarita. Rex was away a lot, but Clara's father visited regularly and bullied his grandson Tony for daring to look like Rex. By now, he would only answer to the name of King, and Clara was unable to stop him picking on her eldest son. By 1941, the ranch had expanded to 600,000 acres. But the entry of America into the war meant labour was suddenly scarce, so they sold off the northern part. The following year, Rex organised a big party at the ranch to celebrate Clara's birthday. But rather than being pleased, she took it as another example of his insensitivity. He knew she hated going out and socialising, so he had had the nerve to bring them into her home to spite her. In 1944, Rex decided to run for the US House of Representatives. Clara felt betrayed and alone. Her somatic symptoms returned with a vengeance, but rather than bringing Rex closer, they simply pushed him further away. One morning, her boys found her slumped in the bed, unarousable, Nembutal bottles scattered across the floor. A doctor was called who pumped her stomach just in time. She had left a note saying she preferred death to a public life. The boys were sent to live with their grandmother, and Clara agreed to move into Las Vegas, so at least Rex would be home every night. Rex opened a western wear store that proved popular with the new tourists flocking to the city, but Clara rarely left the house. Her last public performance was in 1947 on the radio show Truth or Consequences, in which she was the mystery voice for contestants to guess. She hated it. She hated being back in the spotlight again, however briefly. By now, Rex was fed up with trying to placate her anger and bolster her insecurities. Clara, however, still convinced that her problems were physical, saw another neurologist who persuaded her to check into the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, a rather more acceptable name for a hospital than its old one. It was a modern, well-respected and comfortable mental health facility set in 37 acres of manicured grounds, and the plan was to treat her chronic insomnia, dependence on barbiturates, and non-specific abdominal pains. She had a battery of psychometric tests which showed her IQ was above average, bright normal in the language of the day. Another test, developed at the hospital, suggested she had a low conceptual quotient, which was supposed to mean that she was unable to reason and had poor judgment. I managed to find the original paper about this test, which includes some of the reasoning questions. It's not a great copy, but you can just about make out the questions. I don't know what Clara's score was, but some of these look pretty tricky to me. Another test suggested she was a psychopathic deviant. This is not the same as a psychopath, but a term used in the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which had been introduced a few years earlier and is still in use today. And it's a measure of an individual's rebelliousness, reluctance to accept authority, tendency to disregard social conventions, and impulsivity. Pretty much spot on with that one, I think. Other assessments suggested she had been depressed since her retirement, as she had lost her identity, and her pains were deemed hypochondriacal, not made up or consciously exaggerated, but psychological distress experienced not as mental symptoms, but as physical ones. But despite the fact that she did not report any experiences of hallucinations or paranoid delusions, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. None of the medication we now use for treating depression or psychosis was available, so she had electric shock therapy. But the main component of her treatment, as it was for most psychiatric patients at the time, was analytic psychotherapy. Over 10 months, her therapist explored her life experiences and eventually linked the onset of her illness, as well as her insomnia, back to 1922, when she woke up to see her mother standing over her with a butcher's knife. But although Clara accepted that it was a traumatic episode, she rejected this as the explanation for her current symptoms and left the institute. But having had 10 months without her demands and outbursts, Rex did not want her back home. He was too busy with politics, and the boys were at school. So she moved back to Los Angeles to be close to her neurologist and her sons. She tried apartment living, but there was not enough privacy for someone who by now was seriously reclusive. And in 1952 she ended up in another sanitarium where she was weaned off her barbiturates. But as her underlying depression was still untreated, her poor sleep pattern remained, and her neurologist, the eminent Dr. Carl von Hagen, no stranger to the stars as he was married to actress Vivian Tobin, reluctantly prescribed them again. She then moved into a modest rented bungalow in Culver City, which was close to her neurologist's office, and rarely ventured out over the next 12 years. There were her weekly visits to her neurologist, and she would go into shops to buy Christmas presents for her sons. But that's about it. She was under the constant care of a nurse, Estella Smith, who discouraged visitors and always advised her sons not to get her excited. It's hard to get a clear idea of what she was like in her final years. Reclusive and under the constant care of a live-in nurse suggests she was in a very poor mental state. But she painted, read voraciously, the higher brow the better. One favourite was Gibbons's multi-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. She read the newspapers cover to cover and could discuss any news item and all the latest movie news and Hollywood gossip in detail. She occasionally attended her son's football games and corresponded with lots of people from her past. She was very interested in Marilyn Monroe, fascinated by how she negotiated the pressure of being a famous sex symbol. But she never met her, even though Rex had a small role in her final movie, The Misfits. She was also impressed with Marlon Brando's acting, and made a rare trip out of her bungalow to visit him, and he was impressed enough by her to keep her letter. Some old flames did try to get in touch, without much success. But she did see her first fiancé, Gilbert Rowland, quite regularly, but only as a friend. She didn't like the idea of going to movie theatres, so she and Estelle would sit in heavy makeup and dark glasses at drive-ins. With her marriage to Rex irreconcilably broken, Rex moved on. And although he never divorced her, and they had very occasional reunions, he had a long-term affair with Katie Jenkins, to whom Clara would occasionally hurl bitter invective. When her father died in 1959, she was distraught and retreated still further from the world. But she remained proud of her sons, and although she didn't attend their weddings, she thought highly of her daughters-in-law and was delighted when she became a grandmother in 1961. The following year, Rex died suddenly of a heart attack, and she attended his funeral at Forest Lawn Cemetery, her first public appearance in over a decade. Although she was annoyed he left her nothing in his will, she was very comfortably off with her trust fund and spent little anyway. Her last few years saw a revival of interest in her talkies, which appeared on television, but Paramount refused to pay her any royalties, as TV was not explicitly mentioned in her contract. Paramount also inexplicably refused to allow new prints of her early films to be made, which would have allowed them to be shown to a growing audience interested in early Hollywood. This meant that they slowly deteriorated, and many have since become irretrievably damaged. And despite her neurologist's reassurances, she remained convinced she did not have long to live. So she did not take care of her home and ignored her son's suggestions that she replace the worn-out 30-year-old curtains. In 1965, at the age of 60, she died of a heart attack. Her death certificate also mentions acute drug intoxication as a contributory cause. She never could get off those barbiturates, but the autopsy concluded her death was probably natural. She was interred beside Rex at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. After her death, Clara Bow didn't receive the same amount of attention from film historians as other silent movie stars of her generation. Many of her early films were left to rot away, leaving her to be judged on her later talkies, which were not her best. And perhaps there were lingering suspicions that she was more eye candy than serious actress. Sadly, having suffered from fake news about her sexual predilections during her life, this continued after her death in Kenneth Anger's book about the scandals of the film world, Hollywood Babylon. This was the origin of the much-repeated myth about her entertaining the entire USC football team, including a young John Wayne. A falsehood which no amount of debunking seems to be able to get rid of. Louise Brooks, once dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world, who herself went through some dark times after her acting career ended, was a great champion, declaring that Clara made 3 pictures that will never be surpassed: Dancing Mothers, Mantrap, and It.
I thought she was the most marvelous star of the 20s because she was the 20s, really.
I'll leave it to the movie experts to debate her merits on screen and her place in film history. And you can judge for yourselves, as much of her early work is available on YouTube. Those that have survived, anyway. As a psychiatrist, I find her life story fascinating. She clearly had a traumatic childhood, and there is no doubt there was severe mental illness on her mother's side and some serious personality issues on her father's. But I'm not convinced about her diagnosis of schizophrenia. I don't have access to her medical records, and David Stenn, in his otherwise excellent biography, does not provide much in the way of detail about her hospitalizations. But in the 1940s, American psychiatry was dominated by Freudian psychoanalysis, and schizophrenia was regarded not as an organic brain disorder, but as a psychological reaction. This definition comes from the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published a few years later in 1952. But, as you can see, it is so vague, almost any type of emotional disturbance could be included within it. I think it is likely, therefore, that she would have been diagnosed with a schizophrenic reaction, and I don't think the term will be applied to her today. Which of course begs the question, what disorder, if any, did she have? You could make a case for complex post-traumatic stress disorder arising from her difficult childhood, and this overlaps with adult emotionally unstable personality disorder. But these are difficult diagnoses to make even with the person sitting in front of you. And it's hard to know how many of her daily crises, so witheringly dismissed by B.P. Schulberg, were reasonable responses to unreasonable demands. More unusual and harder to understand, however, is her gradual retreat from the world and self-isolation in her Culver City bungalow. It was never complete. She did see the occasional visitor and venture out to the shops at Christmas, and she kept up with the news and corresponded enthusiastically. But she had the means to live a much fuller life if she'd wanted to. The question is, did she simply choose not to? Or was her choice coloured by a bleak, depressive view of the world and everyone in it? It seems likely that her long-standing physical symptoms were the somatic manifestations of psychological distress, and this is common in depression. But again, the descriptions of her final years do not suggest that she was crippled by a life and energy-sapping depressive illness. There was her long-standing dependence on barbiturate medication, which she believed helped her sleep. But barbiturates are highly addictive and do tend to blot out some unpleasant memories, especially if taken at higher than recommended doses. So perhaps Clara was just trying to avoid reminders of difficult times. And she had been through plenty of those. A mother who was never really there for her, a father who was there too much, and the roller coaster ride of being in an industry that can make you an object of adulation by millions one minute, and then discard you like yesterday's news the next. Louise Brooks got it right when she said that after her last movie, she disappeared like an overexposed negative. And yes, she may have chosen to live out her final years quietly, but I think Clara Bow can still inspire us today with her resilience and determination to overcome the difficult start she had in life. She did not give in. She did not settle for ordinary. She chased her dream and achieved enormous success. And I think the captivating personality that helped her become the most popular star of the silent era can still be seen in her movies. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this one interesting. If so, you might want to take a look at my video on another icon of the silent movie era, Louise Brooks. Or a more recent star known for his brooding silences, who was a big fan of Clara Bow, Marlon Brando. As always, I'd love to hear your views on this video and any suggestions you may have for future topics. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.